Hi, I am Dr Lindsey A Davidson. I'm a lecturer in Jewish Studies at the University of Bristol in the Department of Religion and Theology. Today we'll be talking about anti-Semitism and how we can fight anti-Semitism today.
Could you please tell us a bit about the history of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, of course. So anti-Semitism has some of its roots 2,000 years ago with the early rise of Christianity. It goes back further than that, many would argue as well, but there's always been some kind of form of Judeophobia or anti-Jewish hatred or prejudice. And the form that took, particularly in the Middle Ages, was more what we would call anti-Jewish prejudice or Judeophobia. And during that time, some of what contributed to anti-Jewish hatred in medieval Christendom, for example, was to do with perceptions of Jews as outsiders, strangers, being sort of outside Christianity and therefore a threat to the Christian faith. And some of it was to do with perceptions of hostility, misunderstandings about Judaism, and also the many restrictions that were placed on Jews during the Middle Ages in Christendom and also in the Islamic world, where they were second or third class, not even citizens, because no one was a citizen of anywhere back then.
Yeah.
But they had a position of a lot of restrictions, although they did certainly flourish at certain periods and in certain places. There's always been flourishing as well as aggression, sort of more hostile, intense moments of history.
Could you please tell us about the Jews in England in particular?
Of course, so the Jews in England have a very particular history, as do many of the European nations and in the Middle East as well. For the Jews in England, in the 11th and especially 12th century, there were a number of very tense and violent incidents where the tensions between the Jews being perceived as outsiders and associated and restricted to professions like money lending and other professions came to a head. And whenever you get a very hostile situation like that, where there's a lot of resentment or somebody needs to pay for a crusade, for example, you get that hostility taken out on the Jewish people. And sometimes that boils to a head. So this is the violence of the mob. And today, one of the violence of the mob expressions is, for example, cancel culture. So all these things do come to a head when there are things like identity politics about, which may flatten discussion across different groups and societies. And so when those societies are very tense and there's a lot of misunderstanding, you get a lot of eruption of blame and things like expulsions and ghettos and restrictions and things like that. And so with England in particular, in the 12th century, you saw a lot of violence against Jews, a lot of accusations of blood, of child sacrifice, of these things that were very, very violent, and there was a lot of tension there. So this resulted in the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. So there were no Jews living in England from 1290 until their readmission to England in 1655 under Oliver Cromwell. In another 100 years after that, in the mid-18th century, the Jews became citizens in England. And in the mid-19th century as well, they could be admitted to the universities, which were still back then affiliated with the Church of England.
And then between Jews and Christians in Europe, how much was the misconceptions around Jesus? How much hostility did that cause?
That's a great question. So some of that hostility does go back to the New Testament. A lot of the stereotypes and tropes that were attributed to Jews morphed them into this stereotype of diabolical figures, and some of that diabolic characterization was rooted in Judas Iscariot with the betrayal of Jesus for the 30 pieces of silver, which is one of the reasons why medieval kings sort of allowed Jews to do things like usury or money lending at interest, but they didn't always allow them to own land, although we actually know that they did own pockets of land, because sometimes it served as a guarantee of lending. But those things put Jews in difficult positions where Christians would have owed them a lot of money, for example. And of course, if you owe someone a lot of money,
Yes.
it can create a very hostile and tense environment of mistrust and an imbalance of position.
So how true would it be to say that even if a Jewish person was an atheist, would they still be persecuted? And how much does religion and ethnicity within the Jewish people relate to each other?
That's a very good question. So in a Middle Ages context, it wouldn't matter what you believed, you would
Yes.
still be considered a part of the Jewish ethnicity or race or people. And into the modern period as well, again, it didn't matter at all if you were an atheist and a Jewish person in Germany in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. It didn't matter at all what you believed. You would still be considered a Jewish person.
And why is that?
That has its roots in 19th century anti-Semitism, which was very racializing. Around that time, there were pseudosciences such as eugenics, and sort of developing notions of hygiene and health, let's say, and a lot of what characterizes 19th century anti-Semitism, quite strangely, is this notion of pollution and the notion of the Jewish people as sort of eugenically inferior to other races and ethnicities, and there was a very strong perception of threat.
Okay.
And seeing the Jews as an invading kind of weakening force in
Yes.
society, which did have some roots again back to the notion in the Middle Ages again
Yes.
of misconceptions about Jews that are rooted in sort of deception and the blood libel, for example, the notion that the Jews have the weight of the death of Christ as basically the murderers of Christ. And a lot of that gets expressed in different ways for every century and generation, it seems, but those are some of the hallmarks that get returned to again and again.
So does the conspiracy notion of Jews running the world and Jews being really powerful, does that go back to the money lending in the 19th century?
It certainly does. So these very strange and very insidious kind of notions of that we find in anti-Semitism do have their roots very far back in anti-Jewish hatred. The notion of Jews being stubborn, for example, because they did not accept Christ.
Yeah.
The notion that Jews could be seen as deceptive because they will not, sometimes they were forced conversions to Christianity, so there was a mistrust of any Jewish converts to Christianity, for example. So all of these notions that erupt in the modern age of conspiracies about Jews and power and greed do actually have their roots as very, very far back.
So after the 19th century, what characterises anti-Semitism today?
It depends on where you are in the world.
Yeah.
So today in the 20th and 21st centuries, depending on where you are and what groups you're speaking to, there's many different shapes and forms in which anti-Semitism can erupt and arise. One of those is to do with ideas about Holocaust denial, can also be Holocaust minimization or Holocaust distortion. Another area is within the political far left, an anti-Semitic feeling there, and sometimes that expresses itself in anti-Zionism. Elsewhere you may find in Middle Eastern countries anti-Jewish hatred, a lot of it specifically targeted at the State of Israel, but also Jews in general. And then also you have anti-Zionism, which sometimes masquerades a deeper or underlying and unexamined sort of feelings of anti-Jewish hostility.
And David Baddiel, in his documentary Jews Don't Count, he mentions that he doesn't necessarily feel any connection to Israel. So if that is the case, then why does this connection between Israel and the Jewish people still exist and cause hostility?
Yeah, I think some of that goes back to the notions that we find in the Middle Ages and the 19th century that are revolved around how to understand the Jewish people, whether they're a religion, whether they're an ethnicity, whether they're a race as they understood in the 19th century idea of what a race is. Today we might think of Jewishness, some Jews think of Jewishness as a ethnicity and a religion, and some think of it merely as an identity.
Yeah.
So if you're an atheist and very secular Jew, you may still think of yourself as a Jew. So some of that, I think, is what David Baddiel was reflecting upon, the notion that it wouldn't matter to someone on the very far fringes of the political spectrum whether or not they were an atheist or a believer in anything. They would still consider them a Jew, and they could still suffer from anti-Semitic violence.
Okay, well, this has been very informative, and there's obviously a long history of anti-Semitism in the world. And so what do you think the answer is?
Oh, if I had the answer to that. One of the key things to stress, I feel, is that anti-Semitism can't be solved overnight.
Yeah.
And part of how we combat and fight anti-Semitism is by understanding the past, because if you understand the past, you can help understand where things have come from today, and why and where, what the history of ideas is, and what the history of prejudice is, and where some of these prejudicial notions about Jews have their roots in.
Mm-hmm.
And if you, as a person today, consider yourself to be a good person, you want to stand up to evil, right? You want to stand up to prejudice. So what are some of the solutions that we can do? Well, as I say, we can understand the past, we can understand some of the politics of it, and one of the things with anti-Semitism is to understand that there are cycles of anti-Semitism. Right now, for example, we are seeing a bit of a rise in the West and in the Middle East of anti-Semitic violence, and sometimes that's violence against people, online hostility and aggression, as well as attacks on Jewish sites and symbols. So because anti-Semitism has these cycles and eruptions, that means that we as societies have to reflect on if a problem keeps happening again and again, maybe we haven't addressed the root of the problem. So we need to unpack and see why in times of stress and hostility and polarization, when people go to the opposite ends of the political spectrum, why does anti-Semitism then take on a new shape and form, and why does it keep coming back?
And so what can we do to be part of the solution?
There's always something that you can do as an individual. Some of what we need is more academic study of religion.
Yes.
And ethics as well, because the better we understand the religions of the world, where they come from, what they're like today, why people believe what they do, whether that's why they're believing in a conspiracy, why they're believing in religious beliefs or religious experiences, and also why do people think the way that they do.
Yes.
Things like ethics, right? The difference between good and evil, right and wrong. The more that we have people who are studying things like that you find in religion and theology, the better we can cross divides and cross the divides of a very sort of polarized political and social environment, and speak to each other and negotiate, and also confront difficult views. And I think that is really key. We just need to debate a bit more and be more comfortable with what is uncomfortable, because it is very unsettling.
Yes.
It's extremely unsettling to fear for your safety in if you're a Jewish person and you're walking or getting onto a London bus, as we know.
Yes.
You can be attacked if there's some drunk person and there are hostile and terrible people out there. So one of the ideas is that if you are in that position, you need to speak out, you need to be strong and courageous. And I think some of it as well is not about not being a bystander. So this goes back to Adolf Eichmann.
Yeah.
And Eichmann was a member of the Nazi Party. He was part of the logistics of moving Jews into the concentration camps. And there was a very famous trial of him where he was captured and he was brought to Jerusalem, and he was put on trial and he was executed in 1961. And this was very, very controversial at the time because Eichmann was not a big, he was not somebody like Goebbels, right? He was not the one giving the orders.
Yeah.
What was strange about Eichmann was that he was following orders, and that was his line of defense. He said, I was just following orders at the time. But if I compare Eichmann to someone like Oskar Schindler of Schindler's List, Schindler was also not a Jew, but he protected the Jewish workers in his factory. And so he had the moral courage to stand up to evil,
Yes.
even though it was absolutely terrifying at the time.
Yes. So the moral is to be more like Schindler and less like Eichmann.
Yes.
Yes.
But also to understand where people like Eichmann came from.
Yes, of course.
So Hannah Arendt, who was a Jewish political philosopher of the time, covered the Eichmann trial, and it was very controversial at the time because she had a very unique perspective of Eichmann, and she coined this term called the banality of evil. And this is the idea that if you are just following orders, you have no thoughts of your own. One of the words for this today is being an NPC,
Yeah.
right? Of following the crowd,
Yeah.
of having an external scorecard, rather than sort of understanding the difference between good and evil and having courage
Yes.
about what is right and wrong. And so if you have no internal moral compass, it doesn't matter how much you think you're a good and nice person if you're not also being morally courageous and sort of standing up for the good in the world.
Yes, and I guess studying religion will give you some more confidence in that you know what is. You can have a better idea in these circumstances what is right and wrong, and learn about the history, like you said, was so important.
It is, without context, without the context of where these debates about good and evil come from,
Yes.
and what it takes to be courageous and ethical and to be a, quote, good and nice person, for example. Without understanding where those things come from, I think as modern societies find it very difficult if you don't have that sort of orientation that is allowing you to stick with your convictions and stand up for justice. Otherwise you just kind of go with the crowd.
Yes.
And Eichmann was someone who just went with the crowd.
So if anyone watching is interested in learning more about anti-Semitism and how to help, where can they turn to? What resources are available?
There are lots of books out there that are about Judeophobia, that are about anti-Semitism, that are about the history of Holocaust denial especially. These are really important things to kind of look into and read for yourself, and to not trust what everyone today is saying. Just to keep reading, really. Read all that you can, and just speak to different people. Get in the habit of talking to people that don't think the way that you do, and press buttons a little bit sometimes.
Yes.
And one of the things that I love about religion and theology that tends to really characterize many of our students, yourself included, of course, is that we're really not afraid to have uncomfortable situations.
Yes.
And to be confronted with people's unusual views about religion and belief.
And that's really good, because I feel like especially today people are wary about what they say, and so would rather avoid the conversation than attempt to have one and to learn from that. So
Absolutely, yeah. We as I say, we do kind of live in a bit of a polarized world where everything is kind of quite traceable, shall we say?
Yes.
And people are afraid, and especially when you're young, it's quite difficult to start speaking up. But that's when you just have to kind of rely on your inner moral convictions, not following the crowd.
That was really, really informative and interesting, and I just want to say thank you so much for opening up this conversation and giving me anyway the courage to feel like I can talk about these things. So thank you very much.
That's all right. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.